What happens when an elderly man is completely ignored at a car dealership, only for them to discover who he really is the next day? The automatic glass doors slid open as Thomas Grant stepped into the luxurious car dealership. The scent of polished leather and fresh coffee filled the air. Bright overhead lights reflected off the sleek, brand-new sports cars lined up in the showroom. But no one greeted him. No welcome, sir. No polite smiles. No eager salesman rushing to assist. Because to them, he didn't look like a customer worth their time. Thomas, in his late 70s, wore a simple brown coat, slightly worn-out jeans, and old leather shoes. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his clothes made him look like an average retiree, someone who could barely afford the cheapest model on display. Salesmen in sharp suits walked past him, chatting and laughing among themselves. Yet, when another customer, a young man in a designer suit and expensive watch, stepped inside, they rushed to greet him immediately. "Good afternoon, sir. What can we help you with today?" one of them said with a broad smile. Thomas watched as they showered the man with attention, offering coffee, showing him the latest models, making him feel important. And yet, he still stood alone. Thomas wasn't there to waste time. He had come with one goal: to buy a car. Not just any car, but a high-end luxury model he had been eyeing for months. He approached a nearby salesman, a tall man in his early 30s, wearing a sleek navy blue suit. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice calm yet firm. The salesman barely glanced at him. "Uh-huh," he muttered, still scrolling through his phone. "I'm interested in purchasing a vehicle today. Could you help me?" Thomas asked politely. The salesman sighed, finally looking up. His expression made it clear he didn't take Thomas seriously. "Oh, well, sir, these are very high-end vehicles. Maybe you'd prefer something more affordable." Thomas's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Actually, I know exactly what I want," he replied. "I'd like to test drive the new LX 500. The salesman's lips twitched, holding back a laugh. "The LX 500? Sir, that's a top-tier model. It starts at $120,000. "I'm aware," Thomas said evenly. The salesman's smile faded. "Right? Let me check if we have someone available to assist you." And just like that, he walked away. Not to get a car, not to bring another salesperson, just to avoid dealing with an old man who, in his eyes, wasn't worth the effort. Thomas waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. He watched as the same salesman eagerly handed the keys to the young man in the designer suit, allowing him to test drive a sports car without hesitation. A sharp pang of disappointment settled in Thomas's chest. Not because he was ignored, but because this wasn't just about him. How many other people had been treated like this? Then, as if to make things worse, 2 salesmen near the service counter started whispering. "Man, that old guy is still here," one chuckled. "Yeah," the other smirked. "Probably just looking around, pretending he can afford something. Maybe he just wants the free coffee." They laughed. Thomas took a slow, deep breath. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out. But in his eyes, there was no anger, no sadness, only determination. Because what those salesmen didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Thomas stepped out of the dealership, the cold air brushing against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was still inside that showroom, replaying every second of what had just happened. The dismissive looks, the whispers, the laughter. It wasn't anger that settled in his chest. It was something deeper, disappointment. He had lived long enough to know that people often judged others by appearances. It wasn't new, but something about today felt different. They hadn't just underestimated him. They had erased him. To them, he wasn't even worth a second glance. And all because of a worn-out coat and a pair of old leather shoes. Thomas walked toward his car, a black Cadillac Escalade parked just down the street. Frank, his longtime driver, immediately stepped out to open the door, but Thomas waved him off. He needed a moment. Leaning against the side of the car, he let out a slow breath, watching his own reflection in the tinted window. An old man in simple clothes stared back, a man they had ignored. If only they knew. Sliding into the back seat, Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over one name before pressing dial. The call barely rang once before a voice picked up. "Mr. Grant." "Good evening, sir." "Jacob Reynolds, the CEO of Grant Automotive, the man responsible for overseeing all dealerships under the Grant name, including the one Thomas had just walked out of." "Jacob," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to meet me first thing in the morning. We have a problem." There was a brief pause. "Of course, sir." "What happened?" Thomas's grip tightened around his phone. "One of our dealerships just treated me like I was nothing." Another silence, this time heavier. "Wait, what?" "I want every senior executive there with me," Thomas continued. "We're going to pay them a visit." Frank glanced at Thomas through the rearview mirror, trying to suppress a smirk. He had seen that look before. That quiet, calculating stare. The same one Thomas had when he was about to make a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, that dealership wouldn't just have a problem. It would have a reckoning. The next morning, the dealership opened its doors as usual. The employees settled into their routines, completely unaware that today would be different. James, the sales manager, leaned against his desk, sipping his morning coffee as he glanced around the showroom. It was another busy day, filled with the usual routine: spot the wealthiest-looking customers, greet them warmly, and ignore anyone who didn't seem worth the effort. That was how things worked here. That was how he made money. As he finished his coffee, he noticed something strange outside. A line of sleek black SUVs pulled up in front of the dealership. The doors opened almost in sync, and out stepped a group of sharply dressed men in dark suits. They looked like executives, important ones. And in the center of them was someone James barely recognized at first. The old man from yesterday. But today, he wasn't wearing an old coat and worn-out shoes. Today, he wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. His silver hair was neatly styled, and his posture was commanding. The way the other men surrounded him, listening intently, told James everything he needed to know. Something was very, very wrong. The salesman in the showroom started whispering, trying to figure out who the old man was and why he had returned with an entourage. The murmurs turned into hushed panic when one of the senior executives, a man in his 50s with a gray beard, turned to James and asked in a low, sharp voice, "Where is your manager?" James swallowed hard. I'll get him right away." He hurried to the manager's office, his pulse quickening. He had mocked that man yesterday, laughed at him, and now, seeing him surrounded by powerful men in suits, he realized his mistake. Inside the office, the dealership manager, Mark, sat at his desk, completely unaware of what was happening outside. He looked up as James burst in. "Mark," James said, breathless, "you need to come to the showroom. Now." Mark frowned. "What's going on?" James hesitated. "You remember that old guy from yesterday? The one we ignored?" Mark rolled his eyes. "Yeah, what about him?" James licked his lips. "He just walked in with the board of directors." Mark's face lost its color. Without another word, he shot up from his chair and hurried toward the showroom. As he stepped out of his office, he was met with the sight of his entire staff standing stiffly near the front entrance. The executives had entered the building, forming a semicircle near the center of the showroom. Customers watched in curiosity, sensing something unusual was happening. And then, the old man stepped forward. But this time, when he spoke, his voice was filled with authority. "My name," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "is Thomas Grant." A wave of realization washed over the employees. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some of them had heard the name before, Grant Automotive, the company that owned this dealership. James felt his stomach drop. Thomas took another step forward. And I own this place. The room fell completely silent. Mark looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He turned toward James, his face a mixture of shock and panic, as if silently asking if this was some kind of joke. But the terrified expression on James' face told him otherwise. Thomas let the silence linger, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then, slowly, he adjusted his cufflinks and took another deliberate step forward. Would someone like to explain what happened here yesterday? The weight of Thomas Grant's words sank into the room like a heavy stone dropped into still water. The once bustling showroom had gone completely silent. Every employee stood frozen, eyes darting between each other, trying to process the shocking revelation. James felt his pulse hammering in his throat. The old man they had ignored, the one they had laughed at, wasn't just some random customer. He was the owner of the entire company. Mark, the dealership manager, forced a nervous chuckle, stepping forward in a weak attempt to regain control. "Mr. Grant, what a surprise to see you here today," he said, his voice strained. "If we had known you were visiting, we would have." Thomas raised a hand, silencing him instantly. His piercing gaze locked onto Mark, who immediately swallowed the rest of his sentence. "I wasn't looking for special treatment," Thomas said evenly. "I came here like any regular customer. I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one's watching." James could feel the air thickening around them. "And what I saw," Thomas continued, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "was disrespect, arrogance, and complete disregard for the very values this company was built on." Mark's jaw tensed. "Sir, if there was any misunderstanding, I assure you." Thomas turned his sharp gaze toward James. "Tell me," he said, cutting Mark off completely. "How many cars did you sell yesterday?" James's mouth went dry. He hesitated before answering. 4. Thomas nodded slowly. "And how many of those customers did you personally assist?" James felt heat creeping up his neck. 2. Thomas folded his arms. "Interesting, because I recall asking for assistance yesterday, and you walked away." James's stomach twisted. He could feel every eye in the room locked onto him. Mark's expression darkened. He had just realized what was happening. His dealership was under scrutiny, and it was sinking fast. One of the senior executives stepped forward. "Mr. Grant, we take customer service very seriously, and I assure you." Thomas held up a finger, stopping him. "No," he said firmly. "You don't. If you did, I wouldn't have been ignored. I wouldn't have heard my own employees laughing about me behind my back." A ripple of discomfort spread through the staff. Some employees shifted on their feet. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Mark attempted to salvage the situation. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Thomas cut in. His voice remained calm, but the power behind it was undeniable. "I built this company on a foundation of respect and integrity. Every single person who walks through these doors, whether they wear a $1,000 suit or a worn-out jacket, should be treated with the same level of professionalism." Silence. Thomas let his words settle before he took a slow, deliberate step forward, scanning the room. "But that's not what happens here, is it?" James felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Thomas let out a slow breath and turned to face the senior executives who had accompanied him. "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about leadership at this location," he said. Mark's breath hitched. He knew exactly what that meant. Thomas turned his gaze back to him. "And we're going to start with you." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He had spent years running this dealership with the same philosophy: prioritize high-profile customers, push sales aggressively, and disregard anyone who didn't look the part. It had worked. Profits were high. His numbers looked good. But now, standing face to face with the owner of the entire company, He realized none of that mattered anymore. Thomas took another step forward, his presence commanding the room. "Tell me, Mark," he said, his voice calm but razor sharp. "When you saw me walk into this dealership yesterday, what did you think?" Mark hesitated, glancing at the executives behind Thomas, their expressions unreadable. I thought you were just looking around," he stammered. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Looking around?" Mark swallowed hard. "I mean, sir, we get a lot of visitors who aren't serious buyers. We try to focus on clients who are ready to make a purchase." Thomas let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "So, let me get this straight. You decide who is serious based on their appearance? You make judgments before even speaking to a potential customer." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Thomas turned to James. "And you? When I asked for assistance, what went through your mind?" James's heart pounded in his chest. His usual confidence was gone. I didn't think you were interested in buying, sir," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't think I was interested," Thomas repeated, nodding slowly. "So, instead of doing your job, you ignored me. And when I left, you laughed about it." James felt as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. The entire showroom was dead silent, every employee afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Thomas straightened his suit jacket. "Let me make one thing very clear," he said, his voice carrying across the entire room. "This company was built on hard work, respect, and integrity. It was never meant to be a place where people are judged by the way they dress or the kind of watch they wear. That is not who we are." Mark forced a weak smile. "Sir, I completely understand, and I assure you, we will make changes." "There will be changes," Thomas interrupted. "But you won't be the one making them." Mark's smile vanished. "Effective immediately," Thomas continued, his tone unwavering. "You are no longer the manager of this dealership." A collective gasp filled the room. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances. Customers who had been quietly observing the scene looked on with fascination. Mark's face turned pale. "Sir, please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas said. "Leadership isn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the culture you create. And the culture here? It's broken. That's on you." Mark clenched his fists, his pride wounded. "I have years of experience running this dealership. You can't just replace me overnight." Thomas's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Who said anything about replacing you overnight?" He turned toward the senior executives. "I've already made my decision. Your replacement has been chosen." Mark's mouth fell open in shock. "Who?" Thomas glanced across the showroom, his eyes landing on someone unexpected. And in that moment, everything changed. Mark's eyes darted around the showroom, searching for answers, his mind racing. He had been in this position for years. Who could possibly replace him? The room remained silent as Thomas turned, scanning the faces of the employees. Some looked nervous, others looked relieved, but one face stood out from the rest. A young man, no older than 25, stood near the back of the room, his hands clasped together, his face filled with uncertainty. Unlike the others, he hadn't laughed yesterday. In fact, he had been the only one who looked like he wanted to help, but was too afraid to go against his manager's orders. Thomas gestured toward him. "You," he said firmly. "Come forward." The young man hesitated before slowly stepping forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. James whispered under his breath, "No way." Thomas looked him in the eye. "What's your name?" Ethan, sir." "Ethan Carter." "Ethan," Thomas repeated, nodding. "Yesterday, when I walked in, I saw you. You didn't ignore me. You didn't laugh at me. You wanted to help, but you held back." "What?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I knew it wasn't right. But the way things are here, if I went against what my manager said, I probably would have been fired." Thomas studied him for a moment before nodding. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Employees are afraid to do the right thing because leadership has created an environment where arrogance is rewarded and kindness is punished. Mark clenched his jaw. Sir, with all due respect, this kid is barely out of training. You can't seriously be considering. I can. And I am, Thomas cut in. Ethan, as of today, you are the new assistant manager of this dealership. Gasps filled the room. Ethan's mouth fell open. Sir me? Thomas smiled. Yes. You may not have the experience, but experience can be gained. Integrity, however, is something you either have or you don't. And you, Ethan, have it. Ethan looked overwhelmed, unsure whether to smile or panic. I don't know what to say. Say you'll do better than the man before you. Thomas replied simply. Mark shook his head in frustration. Sir, you're making a mistake. He doesn't know how to run a dealership. Neither did I when I started my first business. Thomas shot back. But I learned. And Ethan will too. Because from now on, this place will be built on values, not just sales numbers. The weight of the decision settled over the room. Some employees looked thrilled, while others, especially those who had laughed at Thomas the day before, looked uneasy. They knew the old way of doing things was gone. Thomas turned to the senior executives. We'll discuss long-term management changes later. For now, I want this dealership to start fresh. Effective immediately, we are reevaluating how we treat every single customer who walks through those doors. James and a few other salesmen lowered their heads, knowing that their behavior had just cost them more than their pride. Ethan swallowed hard, then straightened his posture. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this responsibility. But one thing he knew for certain, he wouldn't make the same mistakes his former boss did. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. Let this be a lesson to everyone here. Wealth isn't always loud. Respect should never be selective. And no one should ever be dismissed based on how they look. The dealership had changed in an instant. Ethan was busy helping a couple, patiently walking them through their options without the usual high-pressure tactics. Across the room, a salesman who had once ignored customers was now offering assistance to a man in simple clothes, treating him with the same respect he would have given to a millionaire. Thomas exhaled slowly. This is how it should have been from the start. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. Sir. He turned to see James, the salesman who had dismissed him days ago, standing awkwardly nearby. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something else. Remorse. Thomas studied him for a moment before speaking. Something on your mind? James hesitated, then nodded. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I judged you, and I was wrong. Thomas didn't reply immediately. Instead, he let James sit with the discomfort of his own realization. I've been doing this job for years, James continued, and somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as people. I started seeing them as numbers, commissions, quick wins. Yesterday was the first time I really understood how wrong that was. Thomas folded his arms. And what are you going to do about it? James swallowed hard. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to do better. If you give me the chance, I will. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. He had spent a lifetime knowing that words meant nothing without action. Then, finally, he nodded. That's up to you, James. But you should know, one good day doesn't erase years of bad habits. Change takes time. James straightened. I understand, sir. Thomas glanced toward Ethan, who was finishing up with the couple, shaking their hands as they smiled in appreciation. Then start by learning from him, Thomas said. James followed Thomas's gaze and nodded. I will. As James walked away, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. People didn't change overnight. But sometimes, all they needed was the right wake-up call. And this dealership had just received the biggest wake-up call of all. The evening light filtered through the large glass windows of the dealership as Thomas took one last slow walk across the showroom floor. The place felt different now, not because of the cars or the decor, but because of the people. Ethan stood near the service desk, discussing something with a customer, listening, not rushing. Other employees moved with purpose, no longer just chasing commissions, but actually helping those who walked through the doors. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt at peace. As he reached the entrance, Ethan approached. "Sir, are you leaving?" Thomas nodded. "My work here is done." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, what if things slip back to the way they were?" Thomas smiled. "That's up to you now." Ethan straightened. "I won't let this place go back to the way it was." Thomas gave him a firm nod. "Then I trust you." A moment of silence passed before Ethan asked, "Sir, why didn't you just tell them who you were from the start?" Thomas chuckled. "Because people show their true colors when they think no one is watching. And now, I know exactly who deserved to stay and who needed to go." Ethan absorbed those words carefully. As Thomas pushed open the door, the crisp evening air greeted him. Before stepping outside, he turned back one last time. "Remember something, Ethan," he said. "A business isn't built on products or profits. It's built on people. The way you treat them will always define your success." Ethan nodded. "I won't forget that." Thomas smiled, then stepped out, walking toward his waiting car. Frank was already at the door, holding it open. "Everything settled, sir?" Thomas glanced back at the dealership one last time. "More than settled," he said, sliding into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, Ethan stood at the entrance, watching until the taillights disappeared into the night. This wasn't just a dealership anymore. It was a place where respect wasn't optional. And that would be Thomas Grant's real legacy.